very few people support Maduro or these socialist policies. The Venezuelan people are very hardworking, and they have found out the hard way that voting wrong one time or two times, initially in a few years with Chavez, ended up in this. And I think that initially it was a good experience to have so that we wouldn't commit the same mistake, but now we can't get out of it democratically. And that's what I'm afraid of for the rest of the world. I don't want the rest of the world to make that mistake, and then when they already learned the lesson, they can't fix it. And I don't think that, I think it's a big risk for this country, and it's a big risk for the rest of the developed world.
It's very hard to fix, and in a lot of ways, your grandparents fled Italy and Spain, and there really hasn't been a solid recovery in those countries. They've lived through stagnation and even shrinking populations and shrinking growth. The point, I think, has to be that economics is about people. And I feel like we do a lousy job of sort of explaining why it is that economic principles apply to basic human values, like your ability to feed your kids, your ability to achieve the things you want to achieve in your life, at least try. And to me, those values they're not capitalist or socialist, they're just people values.
Yeah, I agree. I think that you see this a lot in Latin America, that people do anything with what they have. And you see people making businesses from their homes, and they do everything to get out of poverty. And I think that if we just let them, we don't mess up with what they're doing, we don't try to tax them, or we don't try to, regulate them, there's so many people in Venezuela who are trying to get out of poverty, and they're able to do it, but the government just mess ups in their way. And even in the United States, I think that if we go with a message, people who are for liberty everywhere in the world, if we send a message that we're not about, we're just not against taxes, or we're just not against regulation, but we are for lifting up barriers for everybody, especially people who are poor. I think that we can lift up people in this country, and I think the country has already done a great job, but we can do better.
Yeah. We spend so much time raging against government that sometimes we forget to talk about the beautiful things that happen when people are free. And not just like, the fact that in this country, I actually talked to George Will was on the show, and he has this, it's not really a really developed theory, but it's one of the sections in his book where he talks about the fact that maybe Americans are so angry at each other right now because we're almost in a post-scarcity world. We don't think about ever getting in line at the grocery store in hopes of getting bread to feed our kids. It's just not a thing that Americans care about. We don't wonder if when we flip the light switch on, whether or not there's going to be energy, because it's a given. And maybe getting people to appreciate your story is part of the answer, because these aren't givens. These things don't just happen. They happen because a lot of people worked really hard, and a lot of people cooperated and lifted each other up and built something.
I think about it every day. Every day when I walk on the street, when I was walking here, I think I'm not afraid in the street of a criminal just coming and killing me or kidnapping me, which is what happens in Venezuela. I could not have a normal childhood in Venezuela. You cannot go around walking in Venezuela in the street in Caracas, the city with the highest murder rate in the world, without being afraid of being killed or being robbed. And I am able to do that here. Even though, of course, there's cities with more crime here in the U.S., but it's really nothing compared to what I lived through in Venezuela. And honestly, I sometimes mock that a little bit, because for me, even Chicago is like a paradise, and people complain about Chicago. I'm like, oh, come on, you haven't lived in Caracas, And it's not just crime, but it's the electricity, It's not having to worry about stockpiling food because you won't find it in the supermarket. You just think, I don't have flour now. I'll just walk to Kroger, or I'll just walk to Giant and buy it now. That I'm able to do that here, and it's a privilege.